Let me take you back to the summer of 1987, just 35 years ago. Watney's, as it was then, produced a booklet which celebrated 500 years of brewing in Mortlake, from 1487 to 1987. There was to be a festival involving the whole community. A big top was erected on the Brewery playing field, and on the 28th of June the BBC recorded songs of praise there. A medieval banquet was held for employees and licensees. On Mortlake Green there was a floral display, and on the 4th of July a commemorative fountain was opened by the MP Jeremy Handley. There was a medieval fair, a firework display, and Watney's launched a special very strong celebration ale. A week later there was a regatta and a pageant on the Thames. It was a no expenses spared extravaganza. But where did Watney's get the date of 1487 from? Had there really been commercial brewing in Mortlake for exactly 500 years? Was this all fake news, or some much needed publicity for Watney's? Perhaps we should examine the facts. Ale made from malted barley, water and yeast would have been brewed in Mortlake before the Norman conquest. Mortlake's manor house, for example, would have brewed its own ale. It was one of the Archbishop of Canterbury's palaces, where kings and high officials were lavishly entertained, so much ale would have been produced and drunk there. And domestically, families brewed their own ale too. It was a skill that was performed by women in the home throughout the world and through history. So we can say with confidence that ale would have been brewed in Mortlake for possibly 1,000 years, whether for the lord of the manor or for individual households. But there is a distinction between ale and beer. Beer is ale with the addition of hops. The brewing of beer was a skill brought to London by the Dutch in the late 14th century. This was the start of commercial brewing. In the 16th century, beer brewing expanded rapidly. Beer was consumed by all social classes, from local peasants to royalty. Commercial brewing was one of the first industries to grow up along the Thames, and during Elizabeth's reign there were 26 beer breweries in London. These brew houses produced almost 650,000 barrels. So the commercial brewing of beer in Mortlake was a possibility in 1487. But we have no evidence of this, and there is no mention of a brewery in the 1617 survey of Mortlake Manor. This is a land use plan of the eastern section of the brewery site in 1617, produced by Museum of London archaeologists. The site of Mortlake's manor house is marked in blue. Robert Poole had land north and south of Thames Street, where he had a large house and gardens, and probably owned the Rose Garden too. But there is no evidence of a brewery here at this time. But let's have a look at what we mean by the brewery site, and then we can see how it developed and expanded over the years. This is a current outline map of Mortlake, showing the brewery area, the ship and the Jolly Gardeners, the Thames and the playing field. By 1765, there were two small brew houses on either side of what was Thames Street. James Weatherstone's brewhouse was to the north of Thames Street and east of Pembroke Alley. He also owned the Ship Pub. William Richmond's brewhouse in Orange was on the south side of Thames Street and east of Brewhouse Lane. Richmond brew here from at least 1765, and he also owned the Jolly Gardeners. This drawing by Hieronymus Grimm shows Thames Street, which divided the two breweries. And this is another view of Thames Street. And this is where it all started, with just two small 18th century brewhouses. Then in 1807 came a major expansion. John Halford and Thomas Weatherstone purchased for £630 a plot of land north of the brewhouse up to the riverbank, including 104 feet of Thames frontage, along with a dwelling house, brewhouse, stables and other buildings. The house was impressive as it had marble chimney pieces and framed wainscoting. Both breweries now had a river frontage. It was advantageous for breweries to be located by the river, as barges were the preferred means of moving heavy, bulky raw materials when roads were in such poor condition. Changes continued, so that by 1811 Weatherstone and Halford had taken over the Southern Brewery, merging them into one. In 1826, the brewery site was described as having a large brewhouse, stables, yard and malt house. By 1832, John Halford and William Topham were partners in the business, and the brewery was then known as the Star Brewery. By 1840, Halford had died and George Kempson had joined the partnership with Topham. The Mortlake Brewery was now described as a considerable establishment. Charles James Phillips, son of a corn and coal merchant, became a partner with Topham in 1846. And then in 1852, James Wigan, son of a wealthy hop merchant, purchased a half share in the brewery. James was just 20 years old, and the firm became Phillips and Wigan. The brewery was then producing about 25,000 barrels of beer a year. At this time, there were approximately 160 breweries in London. Brewing beer was a lucrative business in the mid-19th century. This is a part of Lee's panorama of the Thames, showing the brewery buildings on the left in 1826. Charles Phillips lived at the Cedars, a fine house on the riverbank, here in pink. This 1865 map shows the brewery buildings in brown and other areas owned by the brewery in cream. Thames Street ran parallel to the High Street to join the public draw dock on the river just west of Bull's Alley. A year later, in 1866, the configuration of Mortlake streets was fundamentally changed when Thames Street was stopped up by the brewers, and incorporated into the brewery site. Local people fought this closure with ingenuity and enthusiasm. Posters appeared proclaiming the brewers highway robbers and greedy Mortlake brewers. Local traders, including drapers, shoemakers, confectioners, carters, all complained and protested vociferously that they would suffer if they lost Thames Street with its easy access to the river. But the proposed plan went ahead despite these protestations, and Thames Street was incorporated into the brewery site. Now there is no Thames Street. The High Street has been widened, and there are railway tracks running through the site to carry goods to and from the river. It is worth noting at this stage that the buildings in red were family homes and were not yet a part of the brewery. However, Phillips and Wigan were buying up many local properties, including the houses along Thames Bank and many local pubs, including the Ship and the Queen's Head. This lithograph by Albert Betts shows the Queen's Head. And this is a close-up of a sign advertising Phillips and Wigan entire and fine old ales. The prosperity of the brewery meant Phillips and Wigan were now an important source of employment in Mortlake. They were dominating the village in other ways too. James Wigan, for example, built railings around Mortlake Green to stop people crossing the grass on their way to the railway station. Here are photographs of Charles Phillips and James Wigan with one of their cask labels. The brewery won contracts to supply beer to the army in India, and it also had a royal appointment to Queen Victoria. The brewery was thriving. However, the Phillips and Wigan partnership broke up in 1877. Charles Phillips continued to run the business for the next 20 years as Phillips and Company. It continued to prosper and build up a reputation for the fine beers of Mortlake. Then in 1889, the Mortlake Brewery combined with Watney's. And in 1898, 3 breweries combined to form Watney, Coombe, Reed. Charles Phillips lived to see his 2 sons become directors of this amalgamated company. He died in 1901. With this merger, Watney Coombe Reed became the largest brewery in London and one of the most important in the country. Its major establishments were at Pimlico, then called the Stag Brewery, and at Mortlake. It was decided that the Mortlake Brewery would expand its own malting capacity, and it bought up several small maltings in East Anglia. And this is the company's steamer, the SS Enid, which carried cargoes of malt from Yarmouth to Pimlico and Mortlake. It continued in service until 1933. However, in November 1902, plans were submitted for an 8-storey maltings building on the Mortlake riverside. These plans were approved the following month, and the maltings were built by December 1903. And this is Albert Betts' drawing of the newly built maltings that we can see today. It took about a year from planning submission to completion. Compare this with today's planning process. This is the site in 1907, with the brewery now occupying all the riverside from Bull's Alley to Ship Lane. Watney's continued to buy up properties around Ship Lane. Some old and overcrowded buildings were demolished, and residents were rehoused in new places, such as Watney Cottages. There were also other new buildings. Guildford House, for example, was built in 1900 and became the residence of the head brewer. This is a photograph of the High Street around the time of World War I, with the brewery on the left. The First World War had a major effect on the brewery. The government feared that beer consumption would weaken the country's fighting capacity, and in 1916 it passed the Output of Beer Restrictions Act. Brewing at Mortlake ceased in May 1917 and did not resume until April 1919. But the war had another, indirect but more memorable impact on Mortlake. Due to lack of passengers crossing the Atlantic, the Mauretania was laid up in Liverpool in 1914. It was refitted and its large steam whistles were no longer required. One ended up being installed on the brewery roof as a time signal to the brewery's workers. It could be heard as the early morning call to work and the announcement that it was time to down tools at 5 p.m. The hour-long dinner break was also marked by the whistle, which became a familiar sound all over Mortlake. After the First World War, Watney's became a very paternalistic employer. It launched a house magazine, Hand in Hand. A sports club was founded in 1919. Cromwell Meadows, what we now call the brewery playing field, was an area of 7.5 acres of rough grazing. It was levelled and prepared for sport, with 6 tennis courts, a pavilion with dressing rooms and refreshment facilities. By 1931, the sports club had 1,665 members, 482 of them from Mortlake. And its members could enjoy cricket, boxing, football, bowls, hockey, swimming, golf and tennis. A bowls match for employees. An annual tenants' day. There were also regular dances, boat race days, baby shows, outings, and children's parties. An aid and benefits club was launched and a convalescent home established in the heart of Surrey with 20 beds, as well as a rest home by the sea in Bognor. In short, the social life of employees and their families centred around their place of work. Traditionally, beer was delivered by dray horses. In 1901, mechanical transport started to be used in addition to horse-drawn vehicles, but the need for horses was still growing. There were then 42 horses, and this increased to 102 in 1905. Alongside the dray horses, the brewery had 11 lorries by 1914, but most of these were requisitioned by the military for war use, along with 12 dray horses, which were sent to the Western Front. Both the lorries and horses supplied the local public houses with barrels of beer and could often be seen on the high street. But in 1922, Hand in Hand reported the disappearance of all horse-drawn drays and their replacement with motor vehicles. There were then 88 lorries, and the Motor Transport Department's repair shop was built on the west side of Ship Lane in 1921 to service them all. The brewery was now expanding into the western side of Ship Lane, and beer itself was also changing. Beer in traditional wooden casks was an unstable product and depended crucially on how well the pub's landlord kept it. But in 1931, Watney's bought up new brewing equipment and started pasteurising ales and bitters, producing a more stable product in stainless steel keg. In 1933, the first consignment of the new keg beer was shipped to India. Unfortunately, the stainless steel containers were much prized in India and seldom returned to Mortlake, so the project was abandoned in 1935. But Bert Hussey, Watney's head brewer, thought of an alternative outlet. Against instructions, he supplied the new keg beer to East Sheen Tennis Club. The idea caught on and started the keg beer revolution. A public competition was held with a £500 prize for naming the new brew. There were 26,000 entries. The winner came up with the name Red Barrel. And this advertising slogan was launched in 1937. This 1939 map shows the brewery at the outbreak of the Second World War. During the previous 30 years, operations had expanded to occupy the whole of the east side of Ship Lane, except for some houses on the lower Richmond Road, Bellevue Row and Lancing Terrace, with Mortlake Green on the left. And on the west side, West Road. Cottages had been built privately in West Road to house 40 families in 1901. And there were also older cottages along Ainscombe Lane and the lower Richmond Road. The Second World War caused problems for the business. The loss of staff to the armed forces, shortages of raw materials, and air raids. There were incendiary bombs in September and December 1940, but the brewery escaped lightly from bombing and continued to produce beer. The government said that there would be no beer rationing, and breweries could continue brewing, unlike the restrictions during the First World War. And here are some highly disguised men in an ARP training session. In 1942, the sports ground was turned into allotments, and the 2 groundsmen were retained to supervise ploughing by horse. Watney's Pig and Rabbit Club was formed in 1942. A sturdy block of 3 sties was built and 42 pigs were in residence in December. The Mauritania whistle was silenced and used only as an air raid warning. It returned to service as a time signal for workers in 1946. Post-war, men came back to reclaim their jobs, and many temporary workers, mostly women, were stood down. 44 of Watney's employees lost their lives in the war. The sports ground reopened in May 1947 with a celebratory cricket match in which Watney's lost to a team including several test players, including Gubby Allen and Dennis Compton. The social club's outings, dances and parties continued after the war. The sports side flourished, with the bowling greens hosting international matches and championships. An international bowls match. and in 1966 the England World Cup squad trained on Watney's playing fields. Mortlake became Watney's main brewery when the Stag Brewery at Pimlico closed in 1959 and was demolished. The Pimlico site, close to Westminster Cathedral, was then developed for office accommodation. The staff were relocated to Mortlake. In the 1960s and 70s, Watney's was at the forefront of technical innovation. It announced in 1969 that after years of experimentation, Mortlake Brewery could replace the traditional batch method of fermentation with a process of continuous fermentation, which greatly speeded up the brewing process. But the company also realized that it had neglected the growing demand for lager. This map shows the brewery site prior to 1971, when a major investment program was announced to increase capacity to over 1 million barrels a year and to allow lager brewing to commence at Mortlake. But the development ran into some problems. Watney's needed more capacity and tried to buy up the Truman's Brewery in Brick Lane. Watney's lost this takeover battle and ended up being taken over itself by Grand Metropolitan Hotels in 1972. That was the end of Watney's as an independent company. But the development program at Mortlake went ahead. In 1972, West Road was demolished, soon to be followed by Guildford House and the cottages on Ainscombe Lane, a total of some 50 family homes. Many of the sports facilities, including the tennis courts, were also lost, and the transport department was razed to the ground. Meanwhile, new buildings were going up. Mortlake Brewery had an unfortunate history of fires, and there was a spate of them in the early 1970s. There were also regular complaints from the Coal Smoke Abatement Society. Brewing was a polluting industry. A major fire in June 1974 was particularly damaging, destroying the new fermentation block. To overcome the loss, the old fermentation block on the east side was brought back into use, and with impressive ingenuity, the wort was pumped along pipes for 3/4 of a mile using a bridge across Ship Lane. However, the increase in capacity created a problem of how to get rid of the effluent. Watney's contributed almost £500,000 to Thames Water to install an extra plant at Kew to process the brewery's sludge so that it could be used as fertiliser. But tragedy struck during the construction of the plant. In August 1975, 2 men, Terry Ainsworth and Bob Sharp, went to the aid of a contractor who had got into difficulties while cleaning an underground tank. All 3 men were overcome by fumes and lost their lives. Ainscombe and Sharp's heroism was acknowledged by the Carnegie Hero Trust, and a plaque was put up on the external wall of the brewery to commemorate them. By the 1980s, under Grand Met, Mortlake was essentially a massive lager brewery, with Foster's and Holston Export the big brands. In 1982, Mortlake Brewery became the Stag Brewery, taking the name from the demolished Pimlico plant. The 1990s were turbulent times in the industry, which saw Britain's giant brewery companies merge, evaporate, or quit brewing altogether. Mortlake Brewery changed owners several times. Grand Met, Truman's, Courage, Scottish and Newcastle, culminating in 1995 with the site being leased to Anheuser-Busch to make Budweiser. It still had a capacity of 1 million barrels a year. This is a photograph of old brewery buildings on the east side of Ship Lane. And this is a second photograph. And a third. And this is a photo of them being demolished in 1995. The east side of the brewery was cleared of these remaining old buildings, leaving just the facade on Mortlake High Street, along with the malt house. A new bottling plant and transport department were built in their stead. And this is a photograph of those modern buildings. The Mortlake Brewery, which in the 1960s had 1,400 employees, had 400 in the 1980s and only 180 by 2015. The workforce declined with automation. The bowling greens had been dug up and laid derelict for many years, and in 2012 the site was redeveloped for housing. This is now Wadham Mews. The last brewing in Mortlake took place in the autumn of 2015. The entire site of some 21 acres was sold to City Developments in November 2015 for a reported £158 million. London has a rich history of brewing, but the capital's brewing capacity was more than halved with the closure of the last remaining mega brewery at Mortlake. Whether we believe Watney's claim that brewing began in 1487 or whether it all started in the early 18th century, the famous Mortlake Brewery is sorely missed. Its departure marks the end of an important chapter in London's industrial heritage and leaves a massive gap in Mortlake's collective inheritance.